The main difference, I think, between, say, contractors and architects and engineers when you're working for them is down to the business model, right? Like it sounds pretty fundamental and maybe it's too abstract, but if you actually think about it, like your average builder is working on a fixed price scenario or some sort of so they've come up with a number, they've given it, and they're working to that number, right? So in those cases, any opportunity that you have to do a workflow that saves them money is automatically money back in their pocket, right? So it's actually quite elusive in the design land because you're focusing on time, like you are selling time and materials. You might have a project point, or you might come in with a contract value or something, but in a lot of cases you are selling time and materials. So you don't get that opportunity. You might do an incredible design or something like that that solves a problem or achieves a problem, but you don't get that direct, tangible outcome, if that makes sense. Like you don't see that immediate impact to a solution that you create. So I actually find it's sometimes harder doing that computational design, except at the early feasibility stages, because that's a very generative process where you're trying to take minimal inputs and like maximize a maximum output to come up with a solution or generate a result. So and the other thing that's intentional, I think, with designers is there's a focus on reducing time. So you hear this all the time. Oh, imagine if we save 25% of drafting or 30% of drafting or whatever. But if you're charging time and materials and hours, your business does not really want to charge the client 30% less.
Hi, Adam. Welcome to the Digital Construction Podcast.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you for having me.
Today, we are joined by Adam Sheather, who is a solution architect at Autodesk. I'm sure everybody knows Autodesk. We will learn more about his role, and we will explore how automation and computational workflows are transforming the construction industry. I'm very excited for this conversation with Adam. Adam, can you start telling us a bit about your career journey and what led you to work in the digital technology space for the construction industry?
Yeah, so my journey started off probably a little bit unconventional. I started off on site in scaffolding, fresh out of high school. So I joined a scaffolding company and started erecting scaffold on the Gold Coast in Australia, actually. Was in there for about 3 or 4 months and then realized I really suck at actually doing the work compared to a lot of people a bit bigger than me. I'm a very short guy. So anyway, I got the opportunity to move in the design and drafting team there. So I started drawing a lot of the temporary works and scaffolding for the projects over the Gold Coast. And that was interesting, using some 3D technology built on top of AutoCAD. So that kind of was a very different paradigm because I was drawing sort of 3D structures, around 2001, 2002, doing quantity takeoffs and all that. Moved into structural engineering, picked up Revit, moved into a reseller, spent a few years there, sort of around the 05 to 07, upskilling a lot of architects, engineers, and then moved into MEP as well. And then went to GHD for a few years over in Malaysia. So I managed a team there more on the BIM consulting side. Worked for a builder for a few years in Malaysia, so a turnkey contractor. So again, very different experience, but helping that team migrate from CAD to BIM processes. Was involved a bit more in the technology side, then moved into AECOM, where I led a lot of the application pieces before then going out on my own and sort of building a technology consultancy, which is still going today, which is automation. And then BIMbeats, the software that I've developed with Conrad Sobin, is also still going, and then moved on to Autodesk. So that's been my journey. So a lot of varied roles, but still very centric around BIM and 2D, 3D workflows.
Yeah, you've seen it all. You've seen all the aspects of the digital automation in construction. That's very exciting. But at the moment, you are at Autodesk, and you're working as a solution architect. So a solution architect, in preparation for this episode, we were discussing that solution architect could be different things depending on where they operate. Can you explain to us what solution architects actually do, and particularly what do they do at Autodesk?
Yeah, so if you actually talk about your solution architect, what their higher purpose role is it's really about bringing business and operations and IT strategy kind of get together. Where you see a lot of disconnects in business is Yeah, and you see this a lot where people comment on, oh, people that don't understand what I do, and I'm building all these, I don't know, scripts or automation, and no one gets it. And a lot of that is that's in the operational realm when they're speaking the world of operations. So, and you hear this a bit, whereas in the business side, this is about finance, upcoming, targets and KPIs, and we've got to win work, and we've got to pay a lot of people. So the idea of a solution architect from an industry point is how you kind of bring those two together and create alignment between the business and operations. Within that, there's a vast spectrum. So we have solution architects that are doing software development. We inside of Autodesk, we have some who plan a lot of the software development. So they will more look at an approach, say a customer has an integration problem. So this will be spec'd out with the customer. We need to integrate with their particular technology stacks with our technology as well in order to achieve an outcome. And then at the higher level on the advisory side, it is about creating these sort of roadmaps to help business to understand operations and kind of target initiatives that are important in the business, so that when you move into operations and you want to get an automation or a solution developed, it's aligned with the business goals. So funding is sort of already mapped out, and there's these pieces. A lot of the time you see a bottom-up approach where they kind of people kind of hit a ceiling, so to speak, when they're trying to get these things approved. And a lot of times it's because they haven't really aligned with the business, if that makes sense. So it's like, well, there's no funding on this. And why isn't there no funding? Because the work wasn't done on the business side to kind of allocate funding in those spaces for improvement. So that it's a vast spectrum. And depending on the seniority of the solution architect, I would say that's where they sit on their journey from a developer all the way up to that sort of advisory role.
Yeah, it must be very interesting. You get to see all of the different products and features that Autodesk is developing or planning to develop. And an interesting one is, of course, we are not talking about anything confidential at this stage, but I think many people are wondering what is going on with AI and Autodesk. Is Autodesk doing anything interesting on the AI side?
Yeah, so it's interesting there because again, if you look at just the AU just gone, and I don't know if you watched the keynote or anything on that, there was a lot of AI technology actually released there. So there's a lot of buzz and chatter around what's happened. And I guess if you haven't watched it, go watch the Autodesk keynote. And then there's also a session on AI as well for those who are interested, that kind of gives you a better insight. But to break it down, if you actually look behind the scenes, like our research team, I think the research team's been running about 8 or 9 years now. I think they originally started way back in 2008 as like a computational team, and now turned into this AI lab. But there's been a lot of papers that have been released, so 90 odd papers plus. These papers are normally released to the AI industry. So even though it might be an AEC-centric sort of research topic on AI or machine learning, those are actually shared with other research institutes. And it's a very, what would you say, computer science heavy read. So a lot of people just don't get involved with them because the underlying technology seems very disconnected from the outcome in AEC. So that's one part. Also, if you're familiar with Hugging Space, I don't know if you've heard of this. Autodesk has a channel there. So Hugging, for those who aren't familiar, it's an AI space. It's kind of like GitHub for AI, for people who are aware. And people put models up there. They put data sets up there. So Autodesk has actually released like some of the largest constraint databases when you're constraining, say, a model with a geometric system, things like that. A lot of those have been released by Autodesk for others to train their own models on as well. So again, if you're not in the AI scene at a really technical level, you're probably just not aware of these things happening. So there's a lot happening there. What that translates to in today, though, and we've been quite transparent around this because obviously there's a lot of worry around AI, some uncertainty around what it's doing, who's doing what. So there is a website. If you go to our Autodesk Trusted AI website, there is actually a breakdown of every feature where we've created like a machine learning model or an AI approach and map that to various features in the software so that people can get some real understanding of where it's used. So it's not this all-encompassing thing. It normally hides itself as little features and buttons and things like that most people might not even associate is a AI, or if we use more technical language, like a machine learning approach to predicting an outcome, say constraining a stretch. Rather than using mathematical functions, we use a prediction function to do that.
And expanding on this AI topic, we have seen the rise of AI agents. So many
Yeah.
people may be familiar with that. And I know you are involved in what is called, this is another acronym, MCPs at Autodesk.
Yep.
Can you explain what they are?
So I think hopefully most people have used LLMs that are out there. So and even that's probably the wrong word. ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Claude, whatever it is. So people I assume have used those. Where they probably haven't done too much is other than chatting with them, you can integrate technologies with them. So email or something like that. So you can actually start it to take actions on your behalf. So, go create a meeting for me and add these 5 people to it. Go summarize this email and put it in a Word document. So those technologies that actually perform those actions, those are MCP tools. So essentially, it's like building a normal API or any sort of product solution that you might build on top of Revit or on top of Autodesk Construction Cloud or any solution. But then instead of you calling those functions directly, what you do is you put a description around that function, like, hey, go and get me all the projects on this hub, for example, and you put that description. So whenever the user's talking to the chat interface, it knows that that tool is available. So you could say, oh, hey, can you go get me a list of projects and tell me all the ones in Brisbane? It would then query that. That would then return that list. The LLM would be able to read that list of projects. Hopefully the locations are there, and then return back in plain language text. Oh, hey, here are the 6 projects we've currently got in Brisbane. So when you start breaking it down, these are like controlled interfaces into other technologies, so you can recall information or you can tell it to take action. And that's when you start thinking about the term agentic. It really is just taking actions on your behalf.
Yeah, that's very exciting. It's exciting to see how this evolves in the future. It's very powerful. And you are, I want to say, an expert in automation. Many people suggested to speak to you about automation, and I know you know a lot. And one of the things that I found always interesting is to find somebody who knows a lot about a topic and say, can you explain what automation in construction is to someone who is new to this topic? How would you explain
Yep.
that?
To explain it properly, I think the easiest way when you're talking to someone new, because there's various levels of automation and there's complexities in that, and it's just getting away from the magic. A lot of people, AI is touted a lot as a magic way to do automation, and that's not really it. It's just reducing the low value tasks and not having to do them yourself anymore through a computerized process or another process. So the easiest way is along my very first job, as I was saying, with scaffolding design, I used to have to extract a bill of materials, essentially. That then needed to be transferred into a spreadsheet, which then had all our cost items for each one. And then you could eventually create a tender or a total cost for that project. Now, that was quite a laborious task. And the reason is the previous people who'd set up that process hadn't thought of a way of just extracting that data, putting it into Excel, and then having sort of another Excel reference it, if that makes sense. So it reads all the quantities automatically. So they were hand typing all that. So it was a very simple automation I didn't have to do any code. I just did some fancy Excel. But what it actually did do was reduce the time of me doing that work from 3 hours to like 30 minutes per project, right? So massive efficiency. But that is an automation that is reducing my time. So that's an interesting part too, because a lot of businesses are time and materials businesses, architecture and engineering, you charge by time. So it's also understanding low value time that you can't really charge back to the customer as well. So trying to figure out a tender is an exercise you really want to automate because you generally can't charge for a tender. Trying to do a simulation of some type is usually a high value exercise. So if you actually think it through, do you really want to automate that if the customer's finding it really valuable, or do you want to explore alternatives and expand on that value to the customer rather than trying to shrink that value, if that makes sense? So I don't know if I've answered it easy, but it is just about reducing those low value tasks, whether it's Excel, whether it's a fancy coding or system, it doesn't matter. You're taking this much time and reducing it to this much time and getting the same outcome or better.
Yeah, that's great. And what are some of the common myths that you encounter when you discussing automation with people?
Yeah, so the biggest myth I think is usually the one that it's only required for big projects or big initiatives. That's usually the biggest one that you see. So people worry that developing the automation is going to take a lot of time. So that's probably one of the really big ones. Um, and the other one is people seem really focused. I don't even know if it's a myth, but it's an interesting one. People seem really focused on automating really cool or interesting stuff all the time. So, like, I don't know, you've got some big fancy system and doing that, but I don't know if it's a myth, but I kind of say it's a missed opportunity. Like, we've developed automations where you automatically download, say, a drawing package. It's a simple tool that goes through all the PDFs, figure out what drawings need to be superseded, what don't, move the drawings that need to be superseded into another folder, rename the other ones with the right version. So very simple file tool, but it's astonishing to me how many people still do that manually because no one's seen the value in automating such a laborious process that kind of gets left to contract admin. Does that, if that makes sense? So I don't know if it's a myth, but more of a missed opportunity that people seem very focused a lot of time on automating really cool or interesting things where you really should be focused on some of the most boring tasks that are out there and how do you solve those?
And one of the challenges that people have, of course, is to develop computational workflows on projects, and particularly the span across multiple disciplines and project stages. But how do you approach the development of computational workflows for projects?
Yeah, so with any sort of computational workflow, and I guess computational workflows are really just automations, but the understanding is they kind of sit within Rhino or Grasshopper or whatever solution, sort of automating a process there, and it's a visual programming, but it's essentially still an automation. I guess the key things for me is always understanding what is the purpose of any computational design workflow, and then what is the value. So a really good example is when Dynamo came around, which is a visual programming package for Revit. We saw a lot of people going and spending a lot of time creating, I would say, routines that automate something that Revit already does. And because Revit's such a sophisticated program, you kind of had users who weren't, really, really knowledgeable with the software going, oh, I don't know how to do that, but I'll go away and program this thing to kind of solve a problem that Revit can kind of do. So I think the first thing when you sort of approach any computational workflow is understanding, do you really understand what the tool is capable of that you've got right now? And then understanding how you tweak that a lot. So you see a lot of people rewriting geometry systems or something when there's a geometry kernel that you can take advantage of. So I've seen people like add in a third-party library and do calculations on Booleans when Revit has that all built in-house. And so they build these complexities without realizing it. So that's probably one thing, is really making sure that you understand not only the problem and the value of the problem that you got, but that the actual technology that you're building on, because you can take a lot of shortcuts by leveraging the underlying system. And then with the development, I think it comes down to if it's the complexity is relative to the task, right? So if you're doing a very simple task, so a good example is we did one a few years ago, a scaffolding, ironically enough, a scaffolding tool where you could draw detail lines in Revit and kind of define your edge protection. And then we would assemble the scaffold based on this customer's components to automatically assemble that, and they could then do a tender or something like that in 3D within Revit. And that was pretty useful, but it solves a task that one user has. So this is this problem again of where you're taking one task that one person has and just shrinking that time to delivery. So that's quite a simple thing to do. Where it gets complex is when you start solving end-to-end workflows. So a good example might be structural integration with a drafting model or something, or whatever you want to call it. So you've got this process now where you've got a decision to be made of who's generating the initial model originally. So let's pretend it's an ETABS model. So first question is who generates the model initially? When does that move back into Revit? And then when do any changes that are either updated in Revit or in ETABS flow back either way? And who's responsible for that? So those are the tasks that become quite challenging, not just because it's jumping between software or anything. Those hurdles can be had. It's really then understanding, like, how does this engineer work? How does the technician work? Who is doing what when? And then is that consistent across that business? So it's very easy, and I find it all the time. People will go and solve that. for a project. And you'll see this a lot. People will go create a computational workflow that's end to end, and it works great. And you see this with a lot of complexity. And all of a sudden, it falls down on the next project. And it's not because there's anything wrong with the flow. It's because the people have now been changed out. The process has now been changed. Even though the project topology is probably the same, these create these inherent things that destroy these. So it's about taking that step back and really understanding, like, are we trying to build this on a project level, which is fine. There's still value to be had there. But are we trying to build this across multiple projects creates a whole another level of complexity. I had a project with a bunch of engineers a couple of years back, some senior engineers doing some early calculations of structures. And I think it took us about 9 months to agree on the spreadsheet that they were all happy to use. And then even after that, I think 30 to 40% of them maybe actually used it and the other guys just refused. So there's a lot of complexity in the people piece rather than the computational piece, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I'm thinking what you just said make me think about my Arup days when people wanted to develop tools every time. And you touched on this. You said sometimes it already exists. It's already available. Somebody may have developed that already, or potentially it's already in Revit. And we have this philosophy that said adopt first, then adapt if you couldn't adopt something, and then only then invent. So it was adopt, adapt, invent. That was the philosophy, to make it very simple for people to understand. Expanding on that, like you have you work with different types of roles. You work with builders, you work with designers, with contractors. I imagine working with them could be potentially slightly different or very different. So how do you tailor your automation solutions to meet the specific needs of these different parties?
Yeah. The difference probably the main difference, I think, between, say, contractors and architects and engineers when you're working for them is down to the business model, right? Like it sounds pretty fundamental and maybe it's too abstract, but if you actually think about it, like your average builder is working on a fixed price scenario or some sort of, so they've come up with a number, they've given it, and they're working to that number, right? So in those cases, any opportunity that you have to do a workflow that saves them money is automatically money back in their pocket, right? So a good example, I was involved in a project in Malaysia a few years ago, and we got the formwork design in these horrible drawings, one of those automated systems that spat out that didn't make any sense. We got that back, and we started looking and we were like, oh, this is a mess. Let's redraw it in Revit so we can actually make sense of it. So we spent about 2 weeks redrawing this. And then we realized through it that the actual formwork that they proposed had 85% custom components, right? So with a lot of these formworking systems, and there's like a lot of, you have the standard out of the box components that are quite cheap, and then you have the stuff that's, custom made that has a fee on it. Now, not assigning blame of how that design happened, but we were able to then take that, just redesign that ourselves, send it back to that particular subcontractor and go, hang on, this is what we're thinking. Brought that customization down by about 15%. And we saved basically the project $4 million in 2 weeks of work, right? That is such an easy, tangible outcome that when your boss goes back, renegotiates with that builder, the money saved, like everyone gets pats, right? So it's actually quite elusive in the design land because you're focusing on time, like you are selling time and materials. You might have a project point, or you might come in with a contract value or something. But in a lot of cases, you are selling time and materials. So you don't get that opportunity. You might do an incredible design or something like that that solves a problem or achieves a problem, but you don't get that direct, tangible outcome, if that makes sense. Like you don't see that immediate impact to a solution that you create. So I actually find it's sometimes harder doing that computational design, except at the early feasibility stages, because that's a very generative process where you're trying to take minimal inputs and like maximize a maximum output to come up with a solution or generate a result. So, and the other thing that's intentional, I think, with designers is there's a focus on reducing time. So you hear this all the time, imagine if we save 25% of drafting or 30% of drafting or whatever. But if you're charging time and materials and hours, your business does not really want to charge the client 30% less. So you need, and even when you do, these hours don't really get captured either. So they get lost, right? Like if someone saves 25% on drafting, it's not like the project saved money. That time gets reallocated somewhere else. And if you're not intentional with that time's getting reallocated, maybe more into engineering or maybe into something of value for the client, that's where you might be more productive, but the project isn't actually seeing any value because that time wasn't intentionally recaptured. So I find that's the interesting part, because a lot of people automatically gravitate to saving themselves time. And what you should be sort of gravitating to, and that's valuable for low value tasks, right? Like if you can have less low value tasks and more high value tasks to a client, but to a client, not to yourself, that's where the value is. But I don't know if that makes sense. It might sound a bit abstract, but that's where I find computational kind of peters out sometimes, because people get so focused on whatever task they're trying to automate. They don't think about that in terms of value to the client. So they sometimes get upset when things get canceled or it doesn't get used or it doesn't get the gravity that it needs through the business. And they spend a lot of time on it, so it becomes meaningful to them. So that's where you see some of these things peter out, if that makes sense. So
yeah. And in your experience, what barrier exists when trying to introduce automation into different teams, and how do you overcome these barriers that you find?
I think when you're trying to get this stuff into different teams, there's a difference between servicing the project and servicing the users. So whether it's an automation or just a process change, a lot of people come in with something to automate something. Let me try and come up with a good actual example. Okay, so a lot of projects right now require some sort of data assigning to all the elements, right? So we have a lot of government entities and asset owners now saying, hey, you need to attach all these attributes to every single object in the project, right? And that's cool. That's a client outcome that might be valuable to the client. But when you're forcing a user to now do all this work that doesn't benefit them in any meaningful way, it's not helping the design, it's not helping them, they're not getting anything out of it. If it's not getting checked properly, they don't even get critiqued on it. It becomes very hard for those users to really care about making sure that process is done properly, if that makes sense. So a lot of the times, even with new technology solutions, so as a BIM manager, for example, we did a lot of BIM management work for contractors. So we would come in, the contractor might be naive to BIM, and so they would bring us in to help support that delivery. And the focus is always on the client. The client wants these things, the client wants this, and the client wants that. But our customer is the contractor. So if we're not producing things of value for them during the process, if we're only focusing like, oh, let's make sure all the data's added to the thing, or now all of this data's added for the owner's kind of going to get that benefit, but our customer, the builder, is not going to get anything out of it, so they're less interested to engage. So we always tried to make sure that there was value for the customer, not just the end client of that, if that makes sense. And if you can generate a value there, even if they're not the end result, through a process or an automation or something, they engage in it way more. Like if you had some data that, I don't know, integrates in to help them do a 4D process, or, assign some values for concrete calculations, you'd be surprised how many like little simple things can be added as part of that experience to give the direct customer value too. So it's not just about ticking boxes in the BIM management plan for the final outcome. Then the customer is more happy to invest, and with the customer being the contractor, to invest in automation initiatives because they're seeing the value as well, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like your very practical approach at the file. I can see that you've tried to embed this automation and digital workflows in multiple places, and you've seen it all. And one of the challenges is all the inefficiencies that we have when we try to develop new digital tools for projects. And where do you see the biggest inefficiencies are, and how can you help the teams to overcome them?
Tough question. What are the biggest inefficiencies? I think a lot of the times people try and build, how would I say it? people try and build solutions to tasks that they have problems with. So a really good example, I think, is this was like an early Dynamo script. I think almost everyone built one back in the day. So when Dynamo first came out with Revit, you had this ability where people would come in and you could build a level generator, right? So you had a little slider. You could slide it up and down. It would add, 10 or 20 or 50 levels or something like that automatically to a Revit project. Because if you'd ever done it before, you're copying and pasting and grouping and all of this sort of stuff. But as a result of that, you would end up with 50 of these in a firm, all of them slightly different, and none of them really achieving a real outcome, if that makes sense. So I think one of the biggest inefficiencies what I'm trying to get to is like, taking a step back, and it's hard when you're new, because when you're new, you're still learning the tools, and there's this difference between trying to master the tool and then trying to actually master an automation. And one of the things that you'll see that becomes an inefficiency a lot is people will start down, say they're doing something as almost a learning exercise. I'm trying to learn the tool, so I'm building this particular script or efficiency to learn the tool, and they get to the end and they don't want to throw it away. So what happens? I've built this amazing thing for the company. Now it's got to go into the company, if this makes sense. And what you've actually taken is a learning exercise and then trying to jammed it into a production workflow. Whereas being very intentional at the beginning is about like, okay, what is it we are actually changing? What is it we are automating? Are we adding a new capability? It's not always about efficiency. Sometimes it's about creating new capabilities. And what is the purpose and the value? And then constructing from that. And all too often, the biggest inefficiency is people go, oh, that sounds cool. As soon as I always hear the word, oh, that sounds cool, it kind of triggers me as to like, because I love doing cool stuff. I stuck Doom in Revit a few months ago. It was a bit of fun. Like I'm all about cool stuff too. But in terms of production workflows, I think cool all too often leads to inefficiency, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I'd like to touch about, to talk about the future. I know it's hard to predict the future. Especially the future of innovation. It's very hard because everything changes so quickly. But where do you see the next big opportunities for automation for the industry?
Yeah, well, I will definitely just preface this by saying I am not a good predictor of future technologies. Sometimes, I got into Revisto and Dynamo and things like that early, but on the counterpart to that, I would have sworn to you black and blue that PDS would die many years ago, and Bluebeam doesn't make any sense. So again, I am not a good predictor of these things like everyone else. But where I see the big next opportunities, I think it's going to be in the AI adjacent space. So these are technologies that work with the large language models and these existing, ML and AI technologies out there, but you're not necessarily building your own. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of value in building like another Anthropic or another OpenAI or something like that. But I think there's a lot of opportunities around this MCP workflow, doing vision. Like, these systems are getting better at reading drawings, interpreting drawings, understanding that. So there's this piece of, can they get to the point where you can feed it drawings? And this isn't about checking for every single, Australian standard and do all the compliance, but you can ask things like right now, which I've seen in people's QA checks, do you have the north arrow on every drawing? That is something that you can create an AI workflow right now with OpenAI, feed it through and just go, hey, do all the GAs have AI drawings? It'll cost you a few cents and it's done. A lot more of the digitization I'm seeing. So we did a project a while ago where we were reading particular values off engineering drawings. This is for over rail lines, putting those values into Excel spreadsheets to calculate something, and those would then drive a strand model. So looking at those opportunities that have been typically much harder for us to do, and AI has allowed that ability to like read documents, read drawings, read images, read photos, all of this stuff, and then translate a meaningful outcome. So I think there's a lot of value in this sort of AI adjacency space initially, rather than the hardcore building, your own ML models from scratch. So I think we've got a lot where it's still just getting started. There's so much white space here.
Yeah, plenty of opportunity in that space. And we are close to the end, but just one more question. One of the things that there are companies that already have established automation teams or digital teams, but there are always like new leaders, new managers that emerge, and they try to figure out this space. But if you could give one piece of advice to a company starting now their automation journey, or maybe they already have something that already exists, but they want to improve it, what advice would you give to them?
I would probably say you're in the best space that you could ever be. Like all the technology stacks that are out there right now are, you can jump into AI, have a conversation about it, start having that first sketching of that, approach. Like, whereas previously what you would have to do is a lot of research, you'd have to go back through. So I think there's a huge opportunity now literally to go to ChatGPT or anything and say, hey, I am doing this. What's this approach? What does this look like? So I think you can get so far just going through that and defining approach to your automation journey, whatever that looks like. But I would always bring it back to, it is these core fundamental concepts. We have a business, and that has objectives around, making money, being sustainable, looking after people. And then we have the operations. And I think the key is making sure those are always in sync, because that leads to making sure that there's funding available for automation, making sure that there's funding for people and budgets. Without someone bridging that gap, that's where you run into problems. So the first thing I would almost always solve is, how in sync is your business and your operations? And that's them both understanding at a high, at an interface level, and where that interface can sometimes be tricky, what the other team is doing. Because when one doesn't understand the other, then that's where you start getting the disconnects and the friction with trying to do various automation initiatives. And it needs to be governed and managed the other way as well. Like all too often, people are afraid to fail. And in a lot of this space, you need to embrace failure. Failure does mean that you cost the business some money. I have done failures where investments were quite large that didn't turn out. And this is part of it. So you need to embrace both sides of this and be honest with each other. And all too often one gets a bit skittish with the other. So that's what I would probably say as advice, a really long way. The very first point is make sure business and operations are aligned, and you can achieve much, much bigger things. If you're just operations doing it by yourself, you'll get to a position, but it'll be a very hard slog because you just don't have the backing to unlock the resources and finances that you need to tackle the big problems.
Adam, this was a fantastic episode. Thank you very much for your time. But if people want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
LinkedIn is my usual go-to, I think, as with most people in this space in our industry. So feel free to reach out there and connect. I'm sharing usually random things. I haven't built anything random that I could share in a while, so I do need to get back into it. But yeah, I do like to play around there and message on that. So yeah.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks.
Not a problem, Andre. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, everybody.